I'm Neil Katz with the Weather Channel, and this is the Climate Corner Office. Today I sit down with Ed Walter, the CEO of the Urban Land Institute, a think tank and advocacy organization for the real estate industry, with a strong focus on the future of cities. And increasingly that future has a large component to their storyline driven by climate change. Thank you for joining us today in the Climate Corner Office.
Great to be here today.
Tell us about the Urban Land Institute. Our viewers may not know the history of the organization and your focus today.
The Urban Land Institute has been around since the 1930s. It has today over 46,000 members worldwide. We focus on a variety of issues that relate to the real estate industry, but I would say in a lot of ways what we're trying to do is help cities plan for the future and help cities develop, help our cities and our members develop the best practices to ensure that cities continue to thrive into the future.
Tell me how climate change is now impacting your members.
Climate change impacts our members because climate change impacts real estate values. And it impacts the future of cities. As you start to deal with rising seas, increasing storm events, extreme heat, all of those factors or all those issues impact the way a city operates. It impacts how our buildings operate, and it impacts how whether it's our tenants or our residents live within those cities. So addressing those issues is critically important to the real estate industry.
So the industry has talked about sustainability for a long time, which in a lot of ways is the marketing of a product that certain socially conscious buyers want to obtain. But the climate change economy is now moving in a different direction, where there's actual physical risks and stranded asset risks to property owners, developers, and their lenders. Tell us how the industry is adapting to this new set of risks.
Well, first of all, I think you're right in the sense that when the industry first began to address these issues, it focused on it from a perspective of sustainability. That was both a mix of a marketing benefit, but also a realistic assumption and recognition that as an industry we had an obligation to adapt practices that would be better for the long run for the industry and really for our communities at large. Today, though, I think as you start to look at what's happened over the last decade or so, we've seen floods increase fourfold since the 80s. We have seen storm events and extreme heat issues double since the 1980s. We've seen temperatures start to jump in a material way, especially over the last 25 years. And as we start to look forward, recognizing that those trends are accelerating, recognizing that 20 of the hottest years ever have happened in the last 22 years, and the last 5 years have been the hottest years that we've seen globally. We're recognizing that this isn't just a trend. This is really the reality that we have to deal with as an industry. And so what that means from a real estate industry perspective and from a community perspective is we need to begin to address how we are going to confront those challenges.
So the New York Times recently had an article on this topic, citing some research that said by 2040, the cost of seawall defense of our coastal cities is $40 billion. If we include smaller communities, that could be as large as $400 billion. We're not going to defend them all.
No.
There will be winners, there will be losers. How is the industry thinking about this?
Well, I think there's a number of answers to that question. The first is that you're right, we probably can't afford to put a seawall up everywhere that it may be required. And so in the long run, what that means is that we need to be thinking about where we should be building in the future and take those sorts of factors into account. So a city like Norfolk in Virginia has already been modifying their development code or their planning code to guide more development activity into those areas, which is really a tidewater area, so relatively low. Drive more of their development activity into areas that are less likely to be flooded in the future, so that you won't have to necessarily build the seawall. you have essentially planned your way out of that by driving development into locations that are more resistant. I think you see that, frankly, in some of what we've read after the flooding in the Mississippi this year, is recognizing that some of those jurisdictions that sit along the Mississippi River are realizing with the increasing frequency of flooding there, they need to be guiding their communities to rebuild after the disaster in areas that are more resistant to potential flooding in the future. So it doesn't mean in certain markets, like in New York or like in Miami, that seawalls aren't likely to be required, because there's such an investment of capital that already sits there. It's not practical to think about moving that city to another location. But for smaller communities where the density of development is lower, that may be a more feasible alternative.
I'm glad you brought up inland flooding, because I think when people think about climate change, their first thought are hurricanes in coastal cities, and certainly those are real risks. But a lot of folks aren't as focused on inland flooding, flooding next to our rivers, or flooding just from 5, 7, 10 days of extreme precipitation, which is increasingly changing the flood map of the interior of this country.
Right.
A place where people aren't really as focused to date. Is the real estate industry focused on top of it? Do they have answers, or is that yet to come?
I don't know that those areas have received quite as much attention, at least probably not in the press in some ways, because we have such a high concentration of our population that lives on the coasts that, to your point, that tends to be what people think of first when they analyze these issues. But when you look at what has happened along the Mississippi River or the Missouri River, and you look at some of our other locations along major rivers in the U.S., it's not a one-time problem. You know, it feels like we've had more than our handful of 100-year events just in the last several years. So I think all of these issues apply there. And in some ways, some of these floods, especially if you look at what we've been experiencing this year, last far longer than what happens in a storm event that might hit either the east or the west coast.
Tell me about how the industry is attempting to price these problems.
So that's the big wild card. It's really difficult to try to factor in what is the impact of rising seas or extreme storm events on the real estate business. So you start with the fact that, yes, there could be a problem, and you could have a disaster, you could have another hurricane could hit. And so what do you do about that as a real estate owner? And the first recourse of any owner is to make certain that they have insurance. And then generally, subject to high deductibles, insurance will generally compensate a real estate owner for a loss that flows out of a major storm event. The problem with that as a long-term strategy is every time we have a bad storm year, take a year like 2017 where the losses in the U.S. were over $300 billion, and less than half of those were actually covered by insurance. What typically happens the next few years after an event like that is there's less insurance available, and the pricing for that insurance changes in a radical way, which makes it way more expensive for an owner of a building in an area that's at risk to actually be able to buy insurance. So insurance is a short-term solution, but not really a long-term solution.
Let's talk about what I think is the elephant in the room in this industry, which is the hot potato of who gets to own the building last when the climate change economy really comes for us in a negative way.
Right. And so, of course, what you're referring to there is the fact that if a building does nothing to protect itself, if a city does little to protect itself, and current trends continue, then a situation where either you're close to the sea, close to the ocean, or close to a major river that starts to see its levels rise, you're going to be dealing with the problem of consistent flooding, which is really going to undermine the value of the building. The challenge, of course, with that is it's hard to predict when it's going to happen. And secondly, a lot of these markets that we're talking about, whether they're New York or Florida or New Orleans or some of the West Coast markets, those are great markets to invest in. And that's where people want to be. That's where rents are rising. That's where, absent this issue, values are increasing. So there's a real challenge for a real estate investor to try to manage between the fear of when that event finally happens where the values start to go down because the problem is so big you can't possibly ignore it, and the opportunity that comes from investing in an area where folks want to be. So I think the way the industry is starting to look at this is I think, fairly interesting, but also fairly complex. There is no one simple answer. As I was describing, you can't rely on insurance for the long run, so you have to start to look at other factors. What we're generally seeing is, based on a survey that we did with Heitman, a major investment entity, we're finding that investors are now taking a more nuanced view to where they want to be both within cities and how much of an investment they want in particular cities. So they are not making a decision to exit a market. They're not sort of striking it off their investment list, but what they're looking to see is the building that they're in the first place, are there ways to make that more resilient? Are there ways to move mechanical systems to higher floors or maybe make the windows more resistant to storm events? They're looking to see what cities are actually being proactive about developing plans to deal with rising seas or storm events. And not only making plans, but the next step in that is going to be the political will to actually affect the changes required to provide that protection. And so if you're a potential building owner looking at a situation where you can see ways to improve your building, you can see that your city is committed to making the changes that are required to protect that location, then that becomes a much more of an investable market. And the flip side is if there's no way to really transform the building to make it safer, and the city that you're considering has apparently no interest in trying to improve its defenses, that really becomes a less desirable market to invest in.
So who's the who? Which cities do you think are on their game, ready, and have the financial wherewithal to defend themselves?
Well, certainly
and which are in trouble?
Miami, which of course comes to everybody's mind because Florida is such a flat, low-lying state. Miami's been very proactive about trying to address this problem. So the city of Miami has already issued a $400 million bond issue that has been designed to fund infrastructure improvements to help make their city more resilient. We've actually done some work with the city of Miami Beach to examine a plan that they were putting together that would really involve raising their street levels, raising their sidewalks, and enhancing their pump capacity to deal with the more frequent, just general flooding that they're experiencing on particular days when there are higher tides. So you're seeing cities like that take steps that are designed to make them more resilient. If you look at New York, which was pounded by Sandy 5 or 6 years ago now, New York has come up with a plan to really create a series of a park along the bottom of the U of New York that would involve both raise the elevation of that area, build in walls that could be raised even higher in the event of a storm event. Now, they're still in the early stages of that. They are, as I understand it, they're going through environmental reviews, so I don't think anybody's put a shovel in the ground, and I suspect it'll take a while before they do. But all of these things are going to take time to consider. So the key at this stage, because we do have time, it is not as if this problem is going to, other than from a storm, it's not as if the seas are going to be rolling over into our streets in the next decade. We have time to address this, but we do need to start addressing it.
Do you see a climate bubble inside the real estate market where there's risks bubbling into assets that aren't being accounted for?
I don't know that I can necessarily point to an example of that, but what I would say is if an investor is taking a very short-term view and not necessarily considering some of these issues, they're running a risk that they will end up in that, if they invest in that wrong market where, in a sense, the city doesn't have the political will to address these sorts of problems, they run that risk that we see some of these trends increasing and we see more storms is really probably in the near term where the problem would come about. They may start to find that they can't get insurance at a level that makes sense, and that will change the dynamic around how the value of that building within that market. Or if this, I mean, if you start to think about insurance, which is a relatively small expense at a property, but if you have to if you lose that insurance, or the deductible becomes considerably higher, and the storm frequency still continues to be aggressive, then you're going to be increasing your capital investment in that asset on a regular basis, which is going to cost you money. And the next buyer, when they buy that asset from you, if nothing has changed, that's going to affect their valuation of the assets. You're going to have a double whammy. You're going to be in a scenario where you're going to be investing in your asset, which is going to cost you something. It's likely not going to be increasing the value of your asset. And on the back end of that, the next buyer is going to see that same problem, and they will pay you less for that asset than they otherwise would have.
So I'm glad you brought up short-term thinking, because I think people outside the industry may not realize that although real estate seems like a long-term play, many players in the industry have short-term positions. The insurance companies get to reprice every year.
Every year,
The developer is in and out in 3 or 4 or 5. Even the asset holders have a 5 to 7 year holding period, and they review their holdings and decide, do I stay or go? And so to some degree, everybody's in a less than 10-year position on real estate, when these risks, we know, really increase radically once you get to 20 and 30 years out. Feels like there's a bit of a hot potato potentially on who gets to hold these properties last. What is the industry doing about that?
Well, again, I think it comes back to the fact that as the longer the term of investment that you have, and some of our institutional investors will be thinking beyond a 10-year time frame, you need to be thoughtful about all these different factors we've been talking about. Is what can you do with the building? What is the city prepared to do to try to deal with the challenges that they're facing? The other thing that I would layer into this is today we're looking at the solutions to these problems with the view of what's been developed over the last decade to confront them. I wouldn't rule out the ability of our cities and our industries and our real estate industry to come up with some other solutions that we probably haven't thought of today that might be able to help address these sorts of problems in the future. But the bottom line is still going to be the one that you're suggesting, is that there will be a point in time where if a city hasn't addressed the challenge, that the value of that real estate will suffer because you have gotten to a point where the impact of the environment on that asset will mean that it is no longer worth what the value of those cash flows, because that's how we think about the business. What is the value of the cash flows that the real estate investment generates? There will be a point in time where those cash flows won't be worth the same in a challenging market as they would be in the center of the country where there's no flood risk.
So that's a really good point. I want to turn to the flip side of this, which is not so much about risk, which is where everyone turns first, but talk to me about those who are seeking new profit, new innovation, new investments in a climate-changed economy.
You know, we have, as an industry, I think it would be fair to say that real estate has been a bit slow to embrace technological advances. That seems to me, based on everything I see in my role here at ULI, to be something that's changing. We are now seeing a number of venture funds that are investing solely in real estate tech. And so you're starting to see more focus on bringing some of the advances that flow from technology to the real estate industry. I think this is one of these areas where we've already seen advances in the sustainability area in terms of building products that allow a building to use less energy, allow a building to actually help not get as hot. You know, there's design features that you can integrate into a building that not only create more efficiency, but actually reduce the heat load. If you put a green roof on the top of a roof, you can reduce the heat that's generated up there by about 30%. So there have been some meaningful advances that have approached this from the sustainability side. I suspect we'll see more of that coming in the future that will deal with resilience. Frankly, some of the advances you've seen in Florida to deal with windows and door assemblies that are designed to handle a 200-mile-an-hour hurricane didn't exist 15 years ago when I first started to own hotels down in Florida.
Fair point. What are the tactics and who are the players in making aggressive moves to profit from climate change? And in this way, I don't necessarily mean just product innovation, but people who are investing in markets and cities that might be the next Miami Beach that's more protected from climate change, or people who might be shorting certain markets. Is that happening today?
You're seeing a move in certain cities to stay within the city, but move to a location that inherently seems to be safer. So a little bit further inland in Miami or Fort Lauderdale. Higher locations, and I think you're seeing more in New Orleans, which is a challenging city from a variety of perspectives. I think a lot of the development now is focused on the higher parts of New Orleans. So I don't know that folks have necessarily identified a substitute city for a particular market. I could envision that that might happen, but that will take a long time because the driver around that will really be the desire on the part of the businesses that operate within that city to conclude that they should move to another locale. And that's going to, my guess is we're going to need to see a more elevated risk profile before we actually see that happen.
Yeah, how much are people thinking about tipping points in big markets, the point at which suddenly people don't want to live there, they don't want to work there, and that can happen very slowly and then all at once.
Right. I think you've seen some of that show up in some of these markets that we've been describing, more on the residential side, where price increases in those markets have not kept up with what you've seen in other places within that state. And I think some of the coastal markets in Florida have shown that. I believe that some of the markets around New York City that are in lower lying areas have demonstrated that, where on an apples to apples basis, comparing to where prices have gone a decade or a decade and a half ago, these markets that are viewed as being at greater risk have not benefited from the same level of price increase. So that's an example of where in an either subtle or not so subtle way, homeowners are voting for where they want to make that investment in the long run. I know that a couple of years ago in the eastern shore of Maryland, the state published a map that showed the most aggressive sea level rise and what it might mean for that community. And when they started to, when homeowners or prospective homeowners started to see what might happen in the eastern shore if you had a 4-foot rise in seas, there was a dampening of activity in that market because of that is so low lying. A lot of that area would have been affected by that type of a level of sea rise. So it's interesting in some ways that because when you buy a home, you tend to buy a home with a fairly long-term perspective. I think some of the best examples we've seen of where there's an issue show up with that type of an investor as opposed to necessarily a professional investor.
Although one of the things that does surprise me on this topic is that the 30-year mortgages in many of these markets have not adjusted. You can get a 30-year mortgage in Miami Beach with no risk premium than you would in any other market, which sort of shocks me.
They have to, I would agree with you, that seems counterintuitive. I suspect if you looked at the average length, average length of a 30-year mortgage in terms of how long the homeowner actually has it, it's nowhere near 30 years. So I don't know what the right number is, but I know it's considerably less than that. And that probably factors into the lender's decision making there.
That's interesting. So the paper says 30, no one holds it for 30, right. So they're averaging out what they really think how long you really stay in that home.
Correct. And I suspect that the median term of one of those mortgages is considerably less than double digits.
Is there anything about the climate change economy that animates or excites you and your members? And it's a time of great change that can often mean great opportunity. What gets people excited?
The opportunity that it creates for investors to succeed going forward. If something's easy, anybody can do it. But when you think about all the different issues we just talked about, what has your building done to protect itself, or what could it do? What could a city do? Will a city do it? How will these trends actually play out? The complexity of all of these issues from a standpoint of a real estate investor is incredibly challenging. But the firms that actually figure out how to address that in the best way, in the most thoughtful way, those are ultimately the firms that are likely to be the most successful going forward. In any of these jurisdictions where climate change, rising seas, or more extreme storms are likely to be a threat. And remember what we talked about before, which is that so many of these cities, because they're coastal, are where a large amount of our population want to be. So there's benefit, there's profit to be found in thinking through these challenges, because the opportunity exists because there's such a great demand for those locations.
So if you're in the solutions business, what keeps your members up at night?
I'd say that any investor that's in a market that is challenged by any of these problems we've talked about, whether it's the fires in the west, the floods in the center of the country, or the challenges of storms or rising seas on the East Coast, if you're confronting any one of those problems, you ultimately need to be worried about that issue as an investor. As we've suggested at different times during this conversation, I think it's hard to argue that the problem won't arrive. The question is when, but not whether.
Are there any denialists you think left in this industry? Folks who just say, not happening, not my problem?
I would say that there may be people that might deny what the cause of the problem is, but I think it's really hard for anyone who's risking capital to deny that there is a problem. The fact that seas are rising, you have to acknowledge that that's happening, or your asset and your city are going to be unprepared to confront it. It's hard not to look at what we've seen in other areas around significant increases in storms and not recognize that that's a problem that you're going to have to continue to confront. So I don't find, we have a large membership. Almost every sophisticated real estate organization is a member. I don't see any of them ignoring this problem.
So the buildings industry as a whole is one of the largest contributors to global warming. What is the industry doing, and how quickly can they do it? Can they radically reduce their footprint, maybe take it down to net zero by 20, 30, or 40, or 50, as some other industries have pledged to do?
So within ULI, we have an organization called Greenprint that represents 30 to 40 of the largest real estate owners in the country and therefore in the world. And they have banded together to evaluate what best practices might be to reduce energy usage, with the goal of reducing energy consumption in all of their holdings by 50% by 2030. And so far, they're executing in line with that plan and have done and are identifying solutions that not only they can use, but broad swaths of our member could also adopt. So I think as an industry, we're motivated to try to solve these problems, because reducing what we spend on energy is net good for our businesses. And I think it's also good for us from a longer term perspective, because we know that if we reduce the amount of carbon that we're creating, that's ultimately good for our cities.
Is this industry going to make it there fast enough to avoid and I'll be specific, to avoid the worst ravages of climate change to come? Scientists believe that most industries need to get to net zero by 2040, 2050 at the latest. Will you make it?
Honestly, I think it's hard to judge that right now. I think that the trends would suggest that we can affect significant reduction in energy usage over the next decade and a half. Whether we can get to net zero is more difficult for me to predict at this point in time. Some of that has to do, though, with what is the source of the energy. And so to the extent that more climate-friendly sources of energy become more readily available, that could significantly change that dynamic. And so if you're combining reducing energy usage in the building, which happens through a variety of methods, with cleaner forms of energy production, then I think you've got an opportunity to accomplish that goal.
Ed, thank you for joining me on the Climate Corner Office.
Great to be here with you today.